นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Blessings, good afternoon to you all. I think the title of today's talk is Buddhist Approaches to Reconciliation and Healing. It's probably been stimulated by people's worries, concerns about the news, about wars, particularly the war in Europe between Ukraine and Russia. But really, these things are nothing new in the world. But we're fortunate that the Buddha came to be in the world 2,500 years ago and gave us some very good teachings on how to deal with conflict. To avoid conflict would be the best, but if conflict has happened, how to resolve conflict and move on. And his teachings were applicable in those days, just as they are this day. So disputes, conflicts, wars, disputes between individuals, groups of individuals, and then the need for peace, reconciliation is nothing new. They were happening before the Buddha came along. And they've been happening since the Buddha came along. But for those who have little dust in their eyes, who are fortunate to have come in contact with the Buddhist teachings, at least we have a whole collection of teachings and practices to help us deal with these things. And one thing that, the Buddhist approach to healing, reconciliation, it starts with each individual. Recognizing that we have a responsibility for our own actions in this world. And if we're experiencing conflict and suffering in our own lives, well, the starting place is to recognize what's going on in your own mind, in your own life, your own actions, your own world, you could say. But that doesn't mean to say to neglect the wider picture of what's going on elsewhere in the world or with other people, but to recognize that we can't do much to help the rest of the world until we've sorted out ourselves or understood ourselves better. So these are the two aspects of, you might say, Buddhist teachings. Buddhist approach to practice is learning about yourself, how to look after and understand yourself better, and then using that, what you've learnt and the peace and compassion and wisdom and understanding that you develop through your own practice, using that to help those around us. So reconciliation implies that there must be two things, or maybe two different sides, or maybe more than two different sides that are opposed. So obviously in a war you have different sides that are fighting, but you can have dispute between two people, so it could be husband and wife, two work colleagues, or an employer and an employee, could be two friends, could be two siblings, two students, two neighbors. Once you've got two people, there's the possibility of misunderstandings and conflict. You don't necessarily need to have two countries fighting, just two people together. If they're not in harmony already, you'll start to have conflict, and then there'll be a need for reconciliation and resolution. So why do we fall into conflicts? Because we don't recognize the truth of the way things are. And the Buddha's offering to the world, he offered that, because of all our internal personal sufferings and problems in life, as much as the greater sufferings and problems of the world, the origin, the cause of it all is ignorance. And this word we use in Buddhism, avijja. Ignorance of the truth, misunderstanding of the truth, lack of knowledge of truth, leads us into all kinds of mistaken views and thoughts and misunderstandings of ourselves and then the world around us. It leads us to have all kinds of false expectations, high expectations, wrong expectations of how life should be, how the world should be. So maybe just in this era, this period, one of your expectations maybe that is challenged at this moment that's bringing you suffering is the world should be peaceful. We shouldn't have wars anymore. I know I think that sometimes. Wars, you tend to think of as something from the past, like world wars and ancient wars. Why are there still wars in the world? It's so, it's time for the world to wake up and not fight anymore. Surely we can do without wars. They're a thing of the past. And yet here we are. They're here. And this is the way things are. So why do we have disputes? Well, it's coming from ignorance, not recognizing the harm we're doing to ourselves and others when we fall into disputes. And then, before we know it, maybe harming each other to the point even of killing each other. But at some point these conditions change, don't they? Even wars have a beginning, they have an end. And that's one thing you can learn from. If you do feel like wars are a thing of the past, that shouldn't be happening now, well, you can learn at least from the wars of the past. And one thing you can see in common is that every war has a beginning, has an end. And this is one of the basic teachings that the Buddha gave us, is to reflect on the impermanent, changing nature of this world. Whether it's just a thought in a human mind to fight someone, to go into a dispute, a conflict, or physical, a violent action with someone else, or a war between nations or groups of people, conflict, whether it's civil war or war between two countries. Wars have a beginning, wars have an end. And there have been many wars in the world's history, and they've all ended one way or another. And then with the ending, there's a chance for reconciliation, for peace. So you might say there's two kinds of peace in the world. There's the peace of not having gone to war in the first place. So like most of the world at the moment is not at the war. So even though your airwaves and your news channels are full of news about conflict, say in Ukraine, actually the majority of the world is not at war at the moment. So that's one kind of peace, the peace of not having gone to war or not going to war. But unfortunately, sometimes countries do fall into their unskillful actions and end up fighting. But then those wars come to an end. And there will be a peace that comes after the war. Because that's what we learn from impermanence. There's a beginning, there's an end. Before the war there's peace, and then after war there's peace. And that's what we have to focus on, isn't it? How to get back to that peace, how to get back to the good conditions that we have when there are peaceful relations between people. Just as when there's peaceful and a peaceful experience in our own mind. When that's disturbed and we get angry or we start suffering in some way, we have to learn how to get back to that. So just as the world has had wars but then managed to find peace, through peace treaties, reconciliation processes, and you might say people just getting fed up with the suffering of killing and destruction, so they're ready for peace. So it could be from those two world wars or all the different smaller conflicts that have happened. Sooner or later peace comes because people just can't fight anymore. I mean, sometimes it's one group manages to conquer another, but still peace will come when people stop fighting and they go back to realizing that peace is the best way to live for human beings. And that also applies for ourselves. If you're a Buddhist practitioner, you're probably used to quite a few struggles in your own mind. Struggles between, you might say, good and evil, the skillful, the unskillful. Sometimes we get angry and then we recognize the suffering we've fallen into and we forgive ourselves, we accept whatever's happened that led up to that angry mood, angry experience, and then we let go. And we return to peace. So in our own lives, our own individual lives, we've also had many inner turmoils, inner conflicts that we've witnessed. They've arisen, they've passed away. And that really is where we have to start understanding what the nature of peace and then disturbance, the opposite of peace, is from our own mind. We've all been angry before, we've all been afraid before, we've all been caught into desires and obsessions and attachments for things that we haven't got before. But those experiences have arisen and passed away, haven't they? They're impermanent in their nature. So whenever we start to reflect on this, develop some mindfulness and self-reflection, we can start to see the impermanent or transient nature of this world from the inside, from our own mind. And that's where you can maybe get an appreciation more for peace. So if you've been struggling in your mind with a period of discontent, anger, jealousy, dissatisfaction, one reflection you can bring up at that time is ask yourself, how long does this last? How long will this last? What's feeding it and what will bring it to an end? Because you've seen it arise and pass away in the past, you've been angry before, you've been suffering before in one way or another, you've seen it in the past, you know it arose, it passed away before. The next time you're falling into a similar state of suffering, you could ask yourself at that time, bring up the mindfulness and ask yourself, how long is this going to last? How long do I need to keep feeding this and holding on to this kind of suffering? Can I let it pass? Can I let it be? And this is an insight you can get into your own mind and the way that conflict and suffering arises in your own mind by establishing, the opposite of ignorance. It's awareness and understanding. And then you can use that for dealing and looking at the world as a whole and for encouraging others to do the same. When we're caught into conflict, one of the problems is at that time that's all we can see. When, say, you have anger arise in a situation, at that moment you tend to be not mindful, not reflective, so that's all you see, all you know at that time. And so you tend to hold on and identify with that mood and keep it going. So the heart of Buddhist practice tends to be to come back to develop mindfulness and awareness and self-reflection, to question that, find skillful ways to do that, practice bringing up mindfulness every day. So the beginning of our practice is learning to develop this quality we call mindfulness, paying attention to the present moment, getting to know yourself, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, becoming aware of your conduct, your speech, your actions, and then looking at cause and effect and what's leading to what. So if you're suffering, there'll be causes for that. At the moment you're suffering, quite often you miss it, don't you? You're not seeing cause and effect at work, you're just stuck in the suffering. So what's the strategy, what's the plan? Well, number one is always to bring up some kind of improved level of awareness. So if you've been practicing any kind of mindfulness technique, reflecting on your conduct from day to day, your speech, your actions, and then developing mindfulness through meditation, that's where you go, isn't it? When you're caught into suffering, whether it's anger, conflict, disappointment, frustration, whatever, bringing your mind back to the present moment, recognizing what's going on and accepting what's going on. Of course, when we're suffering, nobody likes it. We don't like suffering. And so one of the tendencies of the ignorant mind, when we're not fully aware, is to look for somebody to blame or something to blame. Usually looking outside of ourselves at causes and conditions, and that's often where conflicts begin. Not recognizing that the experience of suffering is an internal experience that we have we're experiencing for ourselves. And that doesn't mean to say other people are not involved in the world around us, maybe bringing us suffering as well, of course. But the actual experience of anger, fear, worry, anxiety, all the kind of component parts of what we call suffering, they're experiences that we have as human beings in our own mind. And that's where reconciliation, healing has to begin, doesn't it? Reconciling with whatever is causing that suffering, healing it, rather than just going out to blame something external and then maybe seek to punish or fight or get back at, seek revenge on whatever that external thing is, whether it's a person, a group of people, or something very kind of abstract like a government or a place or something. So the Buddha encouraged us to develop mindfulness every day as a basis for practice. Developing mindfulness using meditation objects such as recollection of the Buddha, mindfulness of breathing, recollection of the thought of loving kindness, for example. To bring attention up, to pay more attention to ourselves, to get used to looking and knowing ourselves in the present moment. Because when you're mindful, you're aware of your body and mind as it is right here, right now. And this gives us a chance to develop clarity. And if we are suffering, or we're caught into internal sufferings and conflicts, or if we're caught into external conflict, you're always going to have a chance to remedy that by becoming aware of what's going on. As long as we're caught in the trains of thought and the concept and the ideals that our mind throws up, and we're not able to reflect on them with much clarity or understanding, then as long as that's happening, there's not much chance of any kind of reconciliation or peace. So the real place for beginning the process of reconciliation and healing starts within our own mind. Maybe even just recognizing that there's a problem, that there's some suffering there, because sometimes we don't even recognize that. We don't know we're suffering. When we're angry, we don't realize we're angry. One of the things the Buddha gave us to reflect on to help become more mindful, more aware, is he encouraged us just to consider the basic condition of being a human being. So as a human being, we're born into the world, and that's something that's the same for every single human being, wherever they are in the world. We are subject to aging. Once we're born, everybody gets older, day by day, second by second. Everybody gets sick in one way or another, sooner or later, ill or injured, aches and pains, or just the sickness that comes with aging of the body. And everybody has to face death. You will definitely die. It's the one thing you know about life, is that you will die at some point. I will die, you will die, everyone in this world dies. If you really become mindful and aware of those simple truths, basic truths that the Buddha encouraged us to reflect on every day, what does that do to your mind? Well, my experience is it brings a great sense of humility, a recognition of the frailty of the physical body, but also of the mind that inhabits the body, because the mind can't stop that happening, can it? Your mind, however smart you are, however much you know, however clever you are, however much power you wield, whoever you are, whatever you are, you can't stop the fact that every day you're getting older, you'll get sick, and one day you must die. So when you reflect on that, it humbles you, doesn't it? It takes your ego, your sense of self or conceit down a peg. That's very useful for us, because that's often the beginning of mindfulness, when you're starting to see the way things are rather than being caught into your own views and opinions about how the world should be, how your world should be, how you should be, and how the world around us should be, and how other people should be. It's just bringing your mind in line with truth. It's that every day I'm getting older, I'm getting sick, I must die. I can't stop that or control that very much. You can do a little bit to ease the pain and reduce the sickness by treatments, of course, but ultimately we can't stop that. So if you become really mindful of that, it brings your mind to a place of clarity, doesn't it? You say, oh, this life I lead is imperfect. This world is imperfect because I'm definitely getting older and going to die one day. And I can't stop that. And the next reflection you might have once you're becoming mindful of this truth is that other people are in exactly the same boat as you. Is there anyone in this world who doesn't get older, get sick and die every day? No. Everybody is heading in the same direction. We're all facing the same challenge, the same difficulty. So one thing you learn in practice of what the Buddha taught is that wisdom and compassion kind of are much the same thing, two sides of the same mind. So the wisdom of becoming mindfully aware and clear that you are getting older, subject to sickness, one day you will die, naturally leads on to the arising of compassion and understanding that other people are exactly the same in that respect. It's a universal truth, isn't it? There's no living being, even animals, insects, whoever, any living being is subject to aging, sickness and death in this world. So as you consider that, even just sitting here listening to me, maybe just take a pause and take a few moments to consider that. Then the next thought is, we're all in the same boat. We've probably got more in common than we realize. Because when we get caught into division, we divide with others over views and opinions, over wealth, money, property, land, power, politics, ideals. We don't see these truths, do we? We get caught into the divisions and the differences, and that's what leads to conflict. But when we pause, pay attention to the way things are, it starts to become more obvious. Oh, they're getting old, I'm getting old. They get sick, I get sick. They're going to die, I'm going to die. Without us having to raise a finger. If you really have insight into the impermanent nature of your own body, the desire, the wish to hurt or harm somebody else or punish someone else starts to fade away, doesn't it? Because you realize they're already suffering. They're already going towards the end of their life, whatever I do. So it's your pride, your ego, your conceit, these qualities that might lead you into conflict with others start to fade. May not be all at once, but the clearer the insight, the quicker they fade. And this sense of universality, universal compassion, kindness arises in their stead. This is one offering that the Buddha gave to the world, is that the human mind can reach a point where it experiences what we call universal loving kindness, universal compassion, universal altruistic joy, universal equanimity. which is a very positive quality. It's not a meaning indifference. But these 4 qualities can be experienced by human beings. Not just the Buddha, but people who have practiced the Buddhist path over the centuries have got to the point where they've experienced what we call universal compassion and kindness. And that means unconditional, without limits, without missing anyone out, recognizing that there are things we all have in common, reducing our own attachment to self and ego and bringing up that sense of, or that mind state, mental state of compassion directed to all living beings. This is possible because people have already proven it. Men, women, young, old, the Buddha and the disciples of the Buddha to this day have proven it over and over again. And one of the causes for that is recognizing that we're all in the same boat. The nature of this world is impermanent. It's subject to suffering because it's imperfect. It can't give us perfect happiness. And it's not self. It's a conditioned realm. As human beings, we're conditioned in that we were born, we go through our life, and then we die. And there's no person who can stop that or control that. If one really sees that brings up this state of compassion, doesn't it? You recognize other people are the same as you. And immediately the very attachments and clinging that would lead to conflict with others start to diminish when you recognize that. That's something you have to cultivate. You have to cultivate the qualities that will lead to that kind of awareness. Developing the mindfulness, developing the insight, knowledge, the vicca as opposed to avijja, which is ignorance, which conditions more greed, anger, delusion, more conflict, more suffering. Vicca, knowledge, comes from clarity, from developing the mind to reflect on things, to see truly the way things are without bias and without hiding from the truths, even the difficult truths. And I'm not saying it's easy, is it? It's not easy to accept the fact that everybody is subject to aging, sickness and death. It's the last thing anyone wants. No one wants to get old. No one wants to get sick. No one wants to die. Of course, our natural craving that brought us into the world in the first place as human beings doesn't like that, doesn't want that. But the whole point of the Buddha's teaching is to remind us and get us to look for ourselves and see that you don't get everything you want in life. You do get aging, you do get sickness, you do get death. And that's everybody across the board, and no one is immune. And if you're ever in a conflict with someone, just bringing up that simple reflection might be enough to help diffuse that conflict, or maybe stop you getting into conflict in the first place. As monks, it doesn't mean to say living together as monks in monasteries in the Buddhist world, we don't ever have differences of opinion and conflicts. But one thing that comes out, if you ever start to disagree with someone or move towards a conflict, you start to realize, what's the point of arguing, fighting over this? We're all going to get old, sick and die anyway. Why add to the problems of our life? That's wisdom, isn't it? When you really see that, it puts things in perspective. And these other things that people argue and fight over, whether it's Buddhist monks or lay people in the world, governments, individuals, what do we argue and fight over anyway? Reputation. We go to court over our reputation, defend it, attack someone else's money, land, property, and we start off in courts and arguments and disputes, and then maybe end up going violent when it's on the level of war. But what is it that people fight over anyway? When you're already subject to aging, sickness and death, these other things that we fight over fade into nothing, don't they? You're fighting over a bit of land, say, the border of your country. I want this bit of land. I want more land so I can have more security and more resources and more people and more this, more that. Yeah, a bit of land, what's the point of spilling blood over land which doesn't know anything? It's just land, isn't it? It's just earth and rocks and trees and things. Same with water. Why spill our blood and kill each other over water? Blood and body is more important. Your body is your vehicle for doing good, for achieving peace and happiness in this life. Why damage that in the pursuit of something less? Money, reputation, power, security, all these things. I'm not saying they're totally unimportant, but they're not as important as life, are they? Life is more important. So this is one of the themes that that flows through the Buddhist teachings. To recognize that the things we fight over are really not that important, not worth it. And we really don't need to fight because we're all going to die anyway. We're getting older, get sick and die anyway. Why spoil it by harming each other in the first place? So the best way of resolving conflicts and healing is actually avoid it in the first place. You avoid going to war, avoid fighting, avoid arguing if you can, because we're all in the same position. We all fear suffering. Nobody likes suffering, and we all want to be happy. We all want to be healthy. Nobody wants to suffer. So why add to the suffering by arguing and fighting over things? But of course, having said that, we do forget ourselves. Ignorance is always slipping into our thinking and our decision making and our activities as humans. So that's why we do have conflicts. We forget the truth. So in the first place, try to avoid the conflict by becoming more mindful, recognizing what we have in common with the other people. It doesn't mean to say you have to love and like everything about them. They may have a different taste in things and different wants and desires, but at least recognize those people also want to be peaceful and happy, and the conflict is only going to damage ourselves and others. If you can recognize that before you even get into the conflict, or as you're getting into the conflict, then you might stop. That's the first thing, isn't it? Then you can apply the same wisdom if the conflict has already occurred, if people have fallen into their wrong views and made the mistake of going to war or fighting or arguing or suing each other, or whatever it is, whatever the dispute has come up. If it's happened already, well, your aim is to get back to that same point where people can see the common humanity between them. If you're dealing with a post-dispute, post-war, post-dispute, then you need to apply these teachings now to the moving on so that people can get back to peace. But it still comes from the same insight, isn't it? This world is impermanent. We're all subject to aging, sickness and death. We all want to live in peace. We all hate suffering. Bringing up this sense of recognition that we're all in the same place and ultimately have the same desires, and trying to get people to see that, see the benefits of peace and good conditions for getting on with our life so that people can move on. So after a conflict, you want to get people to start looking at each other in a new way and see that because we all have things in common, it's time to let go of the past. And that's not always easy, of course, because people remember. But holding on to the past, if it's post-conflict, holding on to the past with anger, going over, blaming, punishing over and over again for the past actions is not going to bring reconciliation and healing, isn't it? It's only going to prolong the war. It's like maybe just adding a bit more to the war afterwards. It's like when people have that desire to have the last word in an argument. You have the last word and you keep the argument going, start it again. Maybe it flares up again. that's not reconciliation, getting back to peace. You really want to see the value of true peace, where you're setting aside the past, letting it go so you can move on. It's not easy, of course. It requires much effort and attention and patience on many people's parts. Skills in speech and negotiation and talking to and doing what we can to get back to this point where everyone sees the value of peace. But one thing that will help is recognizing there's no point carrying along the past. And this is where forgiveness, reconciliation comes in, recognizing the need to set aside the past, put it aside so that you can move on and find peace again. Because if you've had peace in the past, you can achieve it again. You use that to your advantage, that knowledge. So many countries in the world are currently at peace, so they can use that. If they ever fall into war again, we hope they don't. If they do, they have to go back and remember, we were at peace before, we've had it before, and remember the advantages of peace, that you can go about your business without worrying about bombs dropping on you and bullets flying through the air and so on. If you can aspire to get back to that, having remembered it before, then you see the value of letting go of what's happened, putting it aside. Even though terrible things happen in war, in conflicts, even just in arguments, we say very nasty, horrible things. If you really want to reconcile and get back to peace, then you have to put it aside, don't you? You have to be able to set it down. Recognize there's no point carrying the past, all the bad things of the past round us as like a heavy bag full of suffering that you're carrying on your shoulders. We have to really learn to put that bag down for our own benefit and the benefit of others. In the monasteries we have this saying, when you have a dispute between two monks or two groups of monks and they really can't agree and they keep going back over the past, he said this, he said that, the way humans do when we carry the past around. We have this phrase, we say, covering over with grass. It's actually a method the Buddha gave, possibly from the times that he lived in, simple times. So humans, when they had disputes, sometimes they would cover them over the grass, meaning a dispute or a conflict or a war is a horrible thing. It's bad. And so they compared it to dung, poo, something that's smelly, dirty, that nobody wants. So all our accumulated anger and frustration and regret and guilt and hatred based on past events, especially after a war or some horrible dispute, that's still going to be sitting in the mind, and to go back over it over and over again, trying to apportion blame, punish people over and over again after such a terrible thing as a war or a big dispute, it doesn't end it, does it? It just keeps dragging on. And it's like you keep bringing up the excrement, keep smelling it, keep having it in your mind, and it sours the relations between people. You don't get reconciliation, do you? So you have to find a way to end it. So you cover excrement over with grass, and that's literally what you do sometimes in the forest, isn't it? Monks, sometimes we're camping, we're in the forest, you go to the toilet and then you just cover it over with grass or leaves. And sometimes that's what you have to do. And it doesn't mean to say wrongs haven't been done. Things have been done. Things have been said, people have died maybe. But if you keep dragging it up and going over it over and over again, it's just like you've always got the smell of excrement with you in your mind, in your heart, and then other people have it in their hearts, and everybody is worse off. What's the worst thing in your house? Or a smelly toilet, a blocked toilet smells out the whole house, and you can't live after a while if you don't fix it. It's like our minds. If we're holding on to grudges, seeking revenge, seeking to punish others for past wrongs, say after a war or after conflict, we have to recognize the need to set that aside And if we can't do it by talking about things that have happened and repairing the damage in that way, then we cover over with grass and move on. Once you're covered with grass, you move on, you walk away, you leave it, and eventually the grass and the excrement forms compost. That's what compost is, isn't it? It's a mixture of vegetation and manure and poo, and then it gradually becomes compost, and then you can even use it for your garden and put it on trees and things. That's what we have to do with conflict. After the conflict, we have to find skillful ways to cover over with grass, let bygones be bygones, accept what's happened may have been terrible, tragic, horrible, but move on as quickly and as well as we can. Because we all have the same problem. We all are facing old age, sickness and death, and we all want to live in peace and not suffer. And after a war, we're still facing old age, sickness and death, and how to come to terms with the basic sufferings of life. A mind that is still caught in ignorance, greed, anger, delusion, mental suffering, stress and so on. Just because the war's finished, that hasn't finished. So that's obviously a deeper problem that we have to address. The war is like an obstacle that got in the way. It's like something that we threw up just to make life harder for ourselves. If you can recognize that, then you quickly want peace, because there's a deeper issue at hand. The basic issue of pacifying this mind and coming to terms with the deeper reality of existence is, even in a peaceful state, say where I am is peaceful, I hope where you're sitting you're in a peaceful place with no war, you still have to deal with a human mind, don't you? You have to deal with a mind that gets greedy, angry, deluded. You have to deal with the problems of earning a living and then getting old and living with other people, and then sickness, and then ultimately you've got to face the fact that one day you will die. Those problems are still there before the war, during the war, after the war. So really the war is just, if you can see it in this way, it becomes totally unnecessary. It doesn't improve or help anything, because you're still facing the same basic problems. Might as well save all the suffering, not have the war or the dispute or the fight, and just focus on the real problem of understanding the nature of existence, living as a human being in this world, dealing with aging, sickness and death. And that's what the Buddha's message was. That's the real problem of the world, not all fighting over land and security and resources and political ideas and all the things that people dispute and fight about. They're really distractions. They really they're not the core problem of being a human being living in the world. But we forget, because of ignorance, avijja. Avijja is like Mara, it's like this little guy who comes in just to muck everything up and make life harder when it's already hard enough. Before there's a war, life is hard. During the war, life is even harder. After the war, life is hard. So why make a war and this dispute? You're only adding to the problems. But nevertheless, after a war we have to reconcile, so we have to all see the value of peace, get back to that true vision of reality and see, we're all in the same position as human beings, whatever country, ethnic group, religious background, political background you're from. You still have these same basic problems to deal with. You still have an unruly, untamed mind. Greed, anger and delusion are still running wild that need to be sorted out. You have attachment to this body, and this body is getting old, getting sick, heading towards death every day. That's the real problem. That's the real thing to understand and get beyond. And the war was just, suffering that we created unnecessarily, making life harder for everyone. So the Buddhist teachings encourage us obviously to prevent conflicts in the first place. If you're in a conflict, to end it as peacefully and quickly as possible. And if it has come to an end, then to work hard at reconciliation, getting your mind back to the state where you can see other people as the same as you. Bringing up some of that unconditional kindness and compassion, so that you can move on, and you have to let go of the past. And it doesn't mean to say we cut off memories. We still remember the past. Say if you're coming out of a war or conflict, you remember the past. But that memory is something you learn from and use it as knowledge to make you more careful not to fall into the same problem again. So why has, say, Europe had so many years of peace? It's because they realized how bad war was in the Second World War. But of course still people forget, and we do go back to war again, but so far not on the scale of a world war. But when you come out of a war, you have to really work hard not to go back into it again, don't you? So you have to see the value of peace and get people to see that we all benefit when there are peaceful conditions. When people cooperate, we all benefit. And this is one of the ways the Buddha taught the monks. So they're saying when monks fall into dispute, the idea is to get everybody to see that we're all happier and better off when we cooperate. Doesn't mean to say we all necessarily like and love each other, but if we can cooperate with each other in a peaceful way, we can all benefit, we can all move on, we can all grow in our lives and in our practice. And that's what we're aiming for. And we have to forgive. We have to forgive ourselves, because it's very hard to forgive other people if we can't forgive ourselves. But we also have to forgive others, and particularly after a war or dispute, because there will be things that have been done, we've done or others have done, that may be quite terrible after a war, of course. It's the worst tragedies that happen in human existence tend to be wars. So much destruction, loss of life. But we have to be able to move on by forgiving and letting go, however bad it is. And that's our goal, that's what we're moving towards as quickly as possible. So the Buddha said we can learn from ourselves by understanding our own position in life. As a human being, we don't want to suffer. We want to heal our own mind by developing clarity, letting go of the causes of suffering, greed, anger, delusion, developing the path, mindfulness, wisdom, compassion, and then encouraging that in others and in the way we relate to others. And if others are not getting the point yet, well, we have to be patient and we have to develop equanimity. Sometimes you can influence other people and help them, sometimes you can't. I've been meditating for peace in Ukraine, Russia for the last few months since the war started. It still hasn't ended, so I accept I haven't achieved that. I wouldn't expect to. One person can't do it. But if everyone does their little bit, well, you never know, it could have some effect, certainly around the edges maybe, to get people to quieten down and see reason and maybe come to a peaceful, negotiated settlement. But that's all we can do, isn't it? You start from yourself and you work outwards, and you have to be very patient and accept that the world is an imperfect place. People's minds are imperfect, just as my mind is imperfect, and I sometimes lose my mindfulness, get angry, hold on to a grudge. Other people do that. But as you recognize that as the cause of suffering, then your own wisdom and compassion comes up for yourself. And then for other people, you see the same, and you give them the chance to grow and to let go of their own anger and develop the better qualities that the human mind can do. When there's fighting and war, you're not giving anyone a chance anymore. You're just fighting, and it's just destruction. And before things are sorted, a lot of suffering takes place. But if you're aiming for peace, then you're willing to accept people for the way they are, even their mistakes. You're willing to accept yourself, accept others, and then giving people a chance. And we need to do that. That's what a peace negotiation is. You give people a chance to make peace, to develop some understanding, to get back to cooperation again by putting your arms down, your weapons down. It starts with speech as well. The Buddha used to say, before a war, people will be arguing, they'll use their words like daggers. So it starts with verbalization, next comes physical action. So if we all want peace and reconciliation, we've got to start through our speech. Skillful speech, encouraging people to be more calm, more reflective, to seek non-violent means to resolve their differences, to learn to be more cooperative with each other. And then there's a chance people will put down their arms, put down their weapons. So the guidelines are there, the principles are there, and we just, as Buddhists, we do our best to encourage them through our own actions, in our own life, and then encourage others as well. But we really have to start with ourselves, because often it's very easy to look at others and say, oh, they shouldn't fight, they shouldn't do this, they're wrong. But you also have to come back and look at yourself, don't you? Do you still have anger and rage in your own mind? Do you still sometimes lose your temper? Do you still sometimes seek revenge on other people? If we haven't fixed our own mind yet, then we can't rush to fix other people's minds and other people's lives. We're not going to be too good at that, are we? We have to come back and start with ourselves first. And if we find how to bring our own mind to peace, reconcile with our own imperfections and mistakes, then we've got a chance to maybe share something with others. So maybe I've been talking for quite a while now. Maybe I'll leave the talk there, and if there's a chance we can have some question and answers afterwards.